So I'd like to call to order the Boston Region MPO's UPWP committee meeting. I'll start off by reading the accessibility statement. So this meeting is being recorded. It's accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 level AA standards and revised section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, you can contact Kate White, MPO staff, at kwhite@ctps.org or 857-702-3658, or you can type in the chat to her as well. All right. So we'll go ahead and kick off with introductions. So I am Ben Muller from MassDOT Office Transportation Planning, representing MassDOT here. And I will go down the list and call a quick roll. MAPC.
Hello, this is Eric Barrasso with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Town of Arlington.
This is Daniel Amstutz from the town of Arlington.
BPDA. BTD.
Tom Kansas Transportation.
City of Framingham. Town of Medway. City of Newton.
David Kozas from Newton.
Town of Norwood.
Hi, Steve Olenoff. Unless Tom shows up, I'll be representing Trick Subregion.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I think Tom just popped in.
Yeah, I just let Tom in.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll be here.
Thanks, Steve. City of Somerville.
Tom Bett here.
RTAC.
Leonard Dickens here, dry my eyes after the end of the last meeting.
I will circle back. Tom O'Rourke, can you introduce yourself for the record?
Hi, hi, Tom O'Rourke, Town of Norwood, representing Trick.
Great, thanks. All right, and are there any other board members here who'd like to introduce themselves? Let's see the participants here. Seeing anybody, Sandy?
Think we're good.
All right. So we'll kick it off to the agenda here. First agenda item here is public comment. Are there any members of the public who'd like to speak before the UPWP committee today? You can use the raise hand feature here on the Zoom platform. I will call on you in the order I see you. I have a note in the chat from Chris Dempsey. Chris, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Ben. I did not see the raise hand function, so maybe I missed it, but if there are others from the public here, you may want to just ask them to enter a note into chat.
Sure.
So my name is Chris Dempsey. I'm the director of the Transportation for Massachusetts Coalition, which represents more than 100 organizations across the state that have a stake in making transportation work better, and wanted to provide comment on the UPWP studies for federal fiscal year 2022. Appreciate the chance to provide that comment, and to all of you who participate in the process of developing these studies and seeing them through. T4Mass supports the staff recommendation for studies, and in particular, we support the proposed study M5 on congestion pricing. We think that the congestion that plagued Greater Boston in 2018 and 2019 to 2020 was a serious public policy concern, but also an addressable one. We do not need to be stuck with that congestion if we adopt smarter public policies. And regions around the rest of the country are ahead of Massachusetts in applying sound public policy tools to that problem. The congestion pricing study as proposed will help us better understand one of the most important tools, which is to use pricing as a way to more efficiently manage our roads. We think that pricing has the power to significantly reduce and even in some cases eliminate that congestion at a cost of tens of millions of dollars versus alternatives that might cost billions and billions of dollars. At the same time, it will also reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and improve transit and other uses of the road that are high value uses that we need to work well. Many of the costs of congestion are also borne most by low-income communities and communities of color, people who live along highways and breathe in air pollution from those congested highways, or people who take buses to work or to the grocery store or to appointments that are stuck in what was the nation's worst traffic congestion. So we're grateful to the MPO for putting this discussion on the table. And if this study is approved, we will work as the T for Mass Coalition to support and participate in whatever ways are helpful to producing a solid work product that helps guide future discussions in the region and the Commonwealth. Thanks again for the opportunity to comment today.
Thank you, Chris. And just to follow up on the raise hand feature, if you're not seeing it, depending on your Zoom level, you can hit the reactions button and there should be a little raise hand feature down there. But I'll also, of course, if you're in the chat and send me a note, I'll also call on you. Lynn, did you have a question for Chris?
I did. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris. So Chris, when or Mr. Dempsey, when I think T for Mass was supporting an initiative a few years ago to discount non-rush hour traffic. Am I right about that?
Correct.
And so the data to support that is a good thing. Where did that come from?
Well, Glenn, we had a lot of data that we used there, so I'm not exactly sure which set of data you're referring to.
I'm interested in any and all.
We'd be glad to share what we've collected over the years.
Okay.
We think that look, to be very clear, this study is important, and we strongly support the MPO doing it. We also think that it's important in the broader public policy conversation to try to find ways to test and pilot the concept of pricing. It's a very unfamiliar concept to drivers and residents of Massachusetts, but it's actually very common in other parts of the country. And people may have heard me use this statistic before. Of the 10 most populous regions in the United States, the 10 largest metropolitan statistical areas, Greater Boston is the only one of the 10 that does not use time of day pricing on its tolled roads. The only one that does not. Every other of the top 10 does.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Chris. I just really want some answers to the questions. I'm generally supportive, because I just really want to get information and try not to have to redo stuff that we've already done. So you have information from a variety of sources that supported the previous initiative, right?
Yes, but
Okay.
we'd be glad to send you and your team and others on this call some of the data that we've collected over the years.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right, looks like David Kozis, do you have a question as well?
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that I scored that particular project with a low number in my rankings just because I thought we might want to wait and see what happens with congestion when things come back after COVID and with everyone's flexible schedules. I think that nobody really knows what's going to happen, but I think that Chris Dempsey, I think you make some good points, and maybe it's better to be more proactive. I'm not sure, but I am wondering if any other studies are underway that are looking at congestion pricing.
Is that a question for me?
Well,
Sorry.
for anybody who might know.
Yeah.
I don't know of any right now.
Then I will just jump in from MPO staff perspective here to say that I am not aware of anything active in the Boston region at the moment, in particular, specifically on this. And also, I would suggest that we hold conversation about this particular study topic for the study agenda item number 6 when we're talking about the specific study items.
Okay.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you, Sandy. Mark Smith, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm new to this process. I don't know if this is the correct time to weigh in, but I'm here to just add support to a proposal that I helped draft and submit on behalf of a group of organizations in the Blue Hills area that include Brookwood Community Farm, Friends of the Blue Hills, the Urban Outdoors Association, the Mattapan Food and Fitness Coalition, and the Mary Wakefield Arboretum in Milton. I'm the director of the Mary Wakefield Arboretum, and we've been discussing bringing together groups from the Blue Hill areas and the urban neighborhoods of the southern tier neighborhoods of Boston, Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, Rosendale, Hyde Park, and put together the proposal to do a study that would modify or increase access and equity to the Blue Hills by modifying an existing MBTA route to link up the neighborhoods of Hyde Park, Rosendale, and Mattapan to the Blue Hills. The Blue Hills, as you all know, is in the backyard of Boston, but that door to the backyard is locked, and thousands of families, especially those who do not have cars, cannot access the Blue Hills. And we all know the importance and the value of access to the outdoors. So I'm just here to voice support for that study research.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mark Smith? All right, not seeing any at the moment. And Mark, we will be discussing those sort of towards the latter end of the agenda. So if you have the time to stick around, there might be questions for you then as well.
Was I correct to jump in then, or should I have waited to the end?
Yes, that was the correct moment.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions from the public who wish to speak? Not seeing any at the moment. When we get into other agenda items, I will be letting board members speak first, but if you do have a comment during another agenda item, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you. So we'll move on to the next item here, which is the summary of the April 8th meeting. Can I get a motion and a second to approve this meeting summary? Daniel Laniseth?
So moved.
Eric Brassa?
Sorry, I was waiting for someone to unmute me. I'm like trained from MPO meetings. I second that.
Great. So we'll go down the list here. MAPC?
Yes.
Okay. Town of Arlington?
Yes.
BTD?
BTD representing City of Boston. Yes.
City of Newton?
Yes.
Let's see. Town of Norwood?
Yes.
City of Somerville?
Yes.
RTAC?
Yes.
Masstop votes yes. So that passes. So we'll move on to agenda item 4, which is the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP development schedule. Sandy?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think many of you have probably seen this information already, but I just wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to get a look at the now finalized schedule for developing the rest of the UPWP document, and this will also kind of serve as a next steps framing for the discussion that's happening today. So basically today, this committee is going to hopefully select a list of studies to for MPO staff to conduct in the UPWP next year. The next committee meeting will probably be on June 17th, at which that list will be confirmed based on the budget that should be finalized by then. And then the UPWP will be released for public comment at the July 1st MPO meeting, and then endorsed on August 5th. So that information is on the slide. It's also in the UPWP development page on the MPO website, which is a link I just put in the chat. So I think this is pretty straightforward, but I am happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Sure, thanks, Sandy. Any questions for Sandy on the development schedule? All right. Seeing none, I think we can move on to the next agenda item here. Flexible scoping of UPWP studies. I believe Tegan will be presenting.
Thank you. Yes, this is me. So I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's just 2 slides to help kind of lay out the process about a way in which we're approaching the scoping of UPWP studies, which may or may not be, different than what you expected, but there's kind of a process that we're implementing that I want to share with you and get your feedback if you have any concerns. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when you approve the discrete UPWP studies, which is sort of the first box in this vertical process diagram, which you're about to talk about and move forward with today and beyond, we first have those written studies that are revised and put in the UPWP document itself. And I think I just misspoke, revised study descriptions. So those descriptions are still relatively high level, and there's still usually quite a bit of work that does need to go into refining from that description what will be an actual work scope that then both describes the tasks and process in more detail, and then sort of what staff are dedicating their time to it and what that budget looks like. So you usually see those scopes and approve them before we actually begin charging towards that study and charging for the work that we're actually doing to complete the scope. So that covers the second box. And what that is usually funded by is overhead or administrative costs for CTPS as an organization. And that's not unusual at all. That's kind of typical for scope development. But in our case, because of our close relationship with our partners and our stakeholders and the fact that many of these studies require a bit of research and outreach to be able to sort of refine what that scope would look like, some require what is a more than usual kind of first bit of effort before we develop the scope. And that can look like research, it can look like outreach to external stakeholders, or it can be coordination with internal stakeholders. So for example, our discrete study in this fiscal year called Trip Generation Rate Research has actually involved quite a bit of internal meetings and coordination with MAPC and with Mass DOT to continue to evolve what we actually want to accomplish through this study. And that's intentional. There's nothing that's sort of accidental or problem about that. And so what we want to be transparent about, and this is the last box, is that in some cases we believe it appropriate, and we've talked to the chair and the vice chair about this, to use a small portion of what is actually the study funding to carry out that extra little bit of legwork to get to an actual well-refined scope to present to the MPO. So if you actually can go to the next slide. So I mentioned we want to be transparent. So we have an internal process that we've put in place to make sure that we're all on the same page for this, and then that we can be clear with the board about what we've done. So that means as soon as possible, even in this early scoping, the early writing of the descriptions of the study, we want to identify whether we think this additional effort is going to be needed. And that's not, kind of a project manager's decision on their own. They'll need to confirm with their managers, and executive management, such as me, will be notified. So at least we're all aware and there's no surprises. Then when we then implement and develop the scope and bring it to the MPO, we will put on the scope of work the amount of funds that have been expended to date and the amount of funds left, and make sure that the study goals are in fact achievable with the remaining funds. And I don't think we ever expect this to really go above, say, maximum 10% of the total study funds, but this really is sort of a case-by-case basis. And if it seems beyond the usual expectations, we can always as well come to this committee or to the board to make sure that we're all on the same page. So that's all I have. It's just an attempt to be kind of transparent about these processes. I don't want anyone to be surprised. And I'm happy to answer any questions or speak to any concerns that any of the committee members might have.
Thank you very much, Tegan. Yeah, the CTPS puts together very detailed scopes, and typically results in better projects down the line. So more flexibility there tends to be a good thing. I have a question for the staff recommendation for this year. Has this process been sort of baked into some of those recommended study costs?
I will defer to Sandy to follow up with this if you think I'm misspeaking, but we've just kind of firmed up this process. So I think as we go through this UPWP process, we will start to identify. So it hasn't really been baked in yet. We want to layer this onto it in a more, again, in a more proactive way. What we found is we've kind of, this has come up on a case-by-case basis as we're developing the scope. We'll start to take a look at it as you approve the discrete studies that you want to include in this year's UPWP. But I still expect things change, right? And the scope of these studies change. So we still could have kind of changes in the way we're thinking about some of these scopes throughout the first half of the fiscal year, say, as we're developing them.
Great, thanks. Any questions for Tegan on this process? Len?
Yeah, I support this, of course. I mean, and maybe Sandy's going to touch on this. I mean, and I'll wait, of course. I'm just trying to get a handle though on what's the source of funds for the UPWP, because my goal is to just try to get us more money to be able to do more studies. And I mean, I may not be able to do it, but if I have some sense of where it's coming from, at least I can think to myself whether it's a worthy endeavor or not.
Yeah, so I'll let Sandy follow up on this, but we have the kind of the big picture PL funds that comes to the organization through the federal funds and the match that come from the state. And from that bigger pot of funds is where we partition out what we need for all sorts of items in the UPWP, and the discrete studies are a small portion of those funds. And so typically we kind of lay out the whole budget and then determine how much we have left for the UPWP discrete studies. So increasing the funding for the studies means decreasing funding for something else. And that's something we have to kind of work through in an iterative way during our budgeting cycle, which we're in the middle of right now as we're developing the UPWP. Sandy, do you think I spoke to that accurately, or do you want to clarify anything?
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of summary. So I think we should clarify that there are two types of scopes that staff present to the NPO. They're the ones that are funded by this PL funding, which is federal planning funds. And then there's also scopes that CTPS executes on contract to MassDOT and the NPO. And we're talking the process that Tegan's talking about now, and the studies that we'll be talking about in a moment are part of the federal planning funds side of that. There's a little bit of a different process for the contract work that involves a considerable amount of back and forth. And the amount of money that we receive from the federal government each year for planning is relatively constant. It's the contract that's money that's a little bit more up and down in some years.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Great. Tom? Katis?
Yeah, thanks, David. I just had to step out for 1 second, but I have been following it. But so what's the bottom line? I guess I haven't been able to grasp in two sentences what this is. And so that gets my spider sense tingling, saying, wait a second, what's going on here? I'm probably overthinking, but Sandy, what are you saying? That you're going to treat, like, say you have a contract with MBTA, you're going to handle those. What's changing? I don't quite understand. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's not for the MBTA contract work at all. This is just for the 3C federal funded discrete studies that we identify through this UPWP committee process between staff and the committee.
So what about that?
So the bottom line of what's changing is that typically we as staff can't spend any money on one of these study tasks until the scope has been brought to the NPO. And what that means is that if we're funding the scope development costs before we come to the NPO out of admin and overhead funds, that has an impact on everything else in the CTPS budget. So what we're asking from you is your approval to spend a little bit of the project or task funds from the federal planning funds in advance.
Thanks,
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, and sorry, Tegan, I know you explained it,
No, Sandy did a
Thanks.
much
Thank
better
you, guys.
job, actually. Good job,
Thank
Sandy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Daniel?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I had just sort of a similar question to Tom, or just sort of clarifying the, yeah, sort of the ultimate what's going on here. So I think, is it like there's going to be a separate line item specifically for pre-scope development in general, or does it have to be tied to specific projects?
Yes, this would be case by case process. So let me, like, I didn't think of this in advance. I should have, but let me think of just an abstract or an example that doesn't actually exist. Oh, actually, let me think of something where, let's say that we know we want to do like the high crash bicycle and pedestrian location study, right? But we know that we actually have a whole universe of intersections in the Boston region MPO. And the amount of work we're going to do and the amount of coordination we would do as part of that scope might vary by location. And that's not necessarily the case with the study. But let's say that we talk as an organization and we decide that we can't really scope clearly what the work is going to look like until we do a little bit of outreach to the various places where those locations might exist and identify those locations. And maybe that takes a little bit of staff time and $5,000, but that's actually part of the study work. And so we're going to have a line item just for that study to say we'll put a little bit of that time and study work in before we actually have the scope fully developed to present to the MPO board to review and approve, because as you know, those are very thorough scopes, which, you know, Ben nicely acknowledged as well. I mean, the other option is as well coming with a less developed scope and then continuing to evolve it, you know, as we move through the project.
Yeah, thank you. I think my just last follow-up is does that mean that fund, is that like an additional that might be needed on top of a project to do that other scope work? Like if you need to spend some time, does that add on to what the ultimate or the total scope cost ends up being?
Absolutely not. So that's absolutely the goal, is that that's why we'd want to kind of identify up front, like we have this idea, we know it needs a little bit more work before it's crystallized into a scope. That's still part of the overall budget. So we have to be still working within the approved budget amount. So it does not change the total cost of the project.
Okay, thank you.
Steve Olena?
Yeah, I think we did discuss this in the past, as far as like when you had to choose intersections or roadways, you had to do a lot of work to figure out which one, and then that's, you know, where does that money come to do that? So that really makes sense for these. For some of the other ones, it also makes sense if you have the same sort of thing, because you want to get a good scope. Obviously, you don't want to start the project off in the wrong direction from the very start. But it still makes us a little bit nervous, I think, saying, okay, we end up with a little bit less money to actually do this stuff. So that's where I stand.
Yeah, I think, Steve, definitely, this is something we've been talking about for several years now, internally at CTPS, in terms of what we would need for additional flexibility with the scoping. And this proposal that Tegan is talking about today is inspired by what we've been doing for several years now with Mark's group's corridor studies, where we kind of shifted the calendar so they can select the locations they're going to be working at in advance of the beginning of the new fiscal year, and they can really hit the ground running once the calendar flips to October 1st. So, this is kind of the next iteration of that, and I would not be surprised if you see us coming back with more proposals to evolve this further in the future.
Yeah, beyond the location studies, I would just highlight that just beyond the ones that were talked about a few years back, there are 2 studies that this question came up for this year. So this isn't 90% of the studies, this is a very small portion of them. That part of the work is really to do the groundwork to develop the scope, because there's research or other things that need to be done before you can.
Lynn?
Yeah, and so I understand where you're coming from. But when you mentioned the corridor studies, I mean, those are like this. That's like an M1, M2 study, and right. And those are studies that we're going to do because they're linked to LRTP, and we're committed to doing them, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so essentially, I mean, like I see 125K devoted to those. I mean, that's already set aside for that, right?
Those are the studies that the committee has agreed to do on a recurring basis every year. I mean, we still kind of affirm it through a vote, but
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But that 125K is dedicated to it, right? We've already set that money aside. We're not going to decide how much to set aside. So then when you say that, well, some of the money being to do the scope is going to come out of that study, that's already been set aside for it. And I guess even though I support this, because I understand where we're coming from, thinking further ahead and thinking about how to just get more money to do more research, it just seems to me that the money to do the scope should be money that comes from a budget outside the studies. And the reason I'm saying that is that in order to determine which studies to choose, I think we really need to have a better scope or the scope beforehand. So maybe we wouldn't do an extensive scope for every study in the universe, of course not, but I would like to see the scope for maybe like N+2 or 3 of the potential studies we could do so that we could choose amongst them. Because I'll tell you, what we do, my support for the congestion study is really going to come down to the scope, and so to say that we have to choose that before we can do the scope makes it really difficult to feel good about the process. So that's where I'm on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll offer another example that I remember from when I was on the board that I remember being a bit of a struggle, which is when we had a study to look at TNC data, and that study assumed the ability to get that data. And then I think most of the effort was spent on trying and figuring out that we couldn't get it, or that staff couldn't get it in a meaningful way. And so those are the kinds of things that would be useful to have the opportunity to do the research on before committing to the full scope. That is not necessarily what this process that I just presented proposes. So certainly, Len, what you suggest is a separate consideration, which we're happy to talk about if you would like to.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add that, we select the studies at this point in the calendar because that's, we need to have some framework for what we're going to be doing in the UPWP. But even after today, we staff are going to go and write brief written descriptions for them, even before there's a full written scope. And so that's an opportunity as we're writing those to really look around and see what's possible to do. And then they'll be in the written draft of the UPWP. And at that point, there's a chance for the public and MPO members to give feedback. So it's not like anything is final at this point in time, and there's still a chance to do that looking around to make sure something is viable. And there are a couple more checkpoints before everything is finalized, even before the beginning of the new fiscal year.
Gotcha. It might be a way. It might be I'm just using the term scope, in a different way than you are too. So that may be an issue that I need to work out. Another conversation with Tegan and RU. Thank you.
So would it be, just thinking ahead to sort of next year's cycle, would it be helpful to have sort of a note or an asterisk or some other sort of indication of, we know that there's some scope development work to be done on this concept? Because I think that would really help inform us in this process. If we understand, okay, this study is, we're very sure that this is what we're going to do and here's what we have access to, but this study, perhaps we need to do a little investigation into data availability or into the limits of it. Because I feel like just a little note into these short scopes or descriptions or concepts would be beneficial for the committee.
Yeah, we can definitely discuss in further depth for next year's cycle, figure out how to provide a little bit more detail at different times. And certainly, we'll take that into consideration internally in scoping and budgeting for the UPWP next year as well.
And are we looking for a vote on this, or is this sort of an FYI?
I think this can be an informal FYI kind of thing.
Okay. Well, barring any further questions, we can move on to the next agenda item here.
All right, so I'm just going to give a brief recap of the process for folks who may not be familiar with it. But basically, we have a large number of studies that study concepts that MPO staff gather from internally and from external outreach, which is called the UPWP universe. And you can find a link to that on the meeting calendar. And then I, as the UPWP manager, after a couple of meetings of discussing that, take a survey of 2 surveys, one of UPWP committee members and one of staff, to determine what people's priorities for studies in the coming year are. And now the challenge is to go through that and discuss the survey results. And we as staff have gone through our own internal process with the staff survey results and just discussing what's necessary for next year in terms of budgeting staff time and making sure everyone has work to do. And so we've put together what we call the staff recommended list of studies for FFY 2022. And so I'm going to show both of those things briefly, and then we can have a bit of a discussion about it. So this is the summary of survey results. There is a document on the meeting calendar that covers this in much more detail. But this is kind of the summary of how things scored. This is just the committee. We don't make the staff survey results public. So there's that. And then there is the staff recommended list of studies, which is here. You heard Len and I discussing what we call the recurring studies, which is in the right-hand column a moment ago. Those are the ones that the committee has basically said these happen on a predictable recurring schedule. The top 2 corridor studies happen every year. The safety and operations happens every other year. And so we're just going to presume that those are going forward. And the ones in the left-hand column are ones that staff are proposing to go forward for a variety of reasons as priorities in the coming fiscal year. So I am happy to take questions. My proposal, and please, Mr. Chair, let me know if you'd like to do something different, would be that we take questions on the staff recommended list first, and then basically giving people a chance to ask us as staff why we're proposing what we're proposing, either for individual studies or for this as a list. And then if we want to go through the rest of them, if folks have questions about why we might not have recommended something or other, we'd be happy to take questions on that as well. But I'm open to other ways of holding this conversation as well.
Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, that sounds like a good approach. So if you can bring the staff recommended list back up. I think it would be helpful to know a little more detail on, because it's not just the top, the top 10 ranked committee recommendations. So I think it'd be helpful to know a little bit more detail about the process that goes into developing the staff recommended list, and sort of why that might differ. And I do want to add a note that I have been coordinating with the MBTA. That I know there were a number of MBTA related studies with some question marks about sort of internal support from the T and how they align with current T initiatives. And so I do have some thoughts and feedback, and many thanks to the MBTA's capital planning team. Jillian Linnell and Josh Klingenstein did most of the grunt work while I was out ill. So I can't take any credit for it at all, except for summarizing it and reading it. But I do have that. So if any of the MBTA studies come up, I most likely have at least a note from someone relevant internal about their importance.
All right, so I can speak a little bit more about the process to start off with. And so basically, as I mentioned, there are these 2 studies, one for the committee, one for staff. And we have a meeting with myself and group managers and directors at the MPO once I've collected all of that data. And we take into consideration basically several sources of data on priorities. One is how the committee ranked things. We have the results from that, which we average out and kind of see who's got what as a high priority and a low priority. And then also internal considerations, because the funding through the UPWP and for these discrete studies is really crucial in making sure that everybody at CTPS has enough work to go around in the coming year, and that we're fully supporting all of our staff. And also, on the other hand, we need to make sure we're not overloading any particular person or work group with work. So there's two inputs. One is like what the committee wants and what individual staff members want as informed by the survey. And then there's the very practical considerations about resource management and budgeting. And all of that we just sit down for 90 minutes or 2 hours and talk through it for a while. And that's really where we come up with this list, which is trying to balance making sure the various CTPS work groups have enough work, and that we're doing stuff that is following the goals and objectives of the NPO, and that will be of interest and usefulness to our stakeholders and our partner agencies.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So I'll start calling on people who have their hands raised. Looks like Eric Barassa, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a couple questions and then a few comments too. So definitely, Ben, I'd love to hear the response from the T, because as you publish my comments, I'm supportive of a lot of the proposals, but I really feel like we need to understand if that's work that can be complementary to what the T is doing, and obviously if that's expertise that CTPS has. So love to hear that. So at some point, if you can provide that, that'd be great. I'm interested in discussing the TDM follow-up study. And the reason why I'm interested in this one is I had a separate conversation with Representative Sicolo about her study proposal, which was entitled Innovative Transportation Finance. But really, what she was proposing was not really, I don't think her proposal was as much digging into the innovative financing of shuttle buses as it was more about really trying to understand what shuttle bus systems are most effective in Massachusetts and in our region, and why, and like what are the features about that, and maybe even looking at some other places around the country. But I think she was most interested in about understanding which ones in our region are most successful and what's the reason for that. And so I've recently had a number of conversations with some of the folks who manage the transportation management associations and folks at Mass Commute about TMAs and transportation demand management. And I'm wondering if there is an opportunity to fold some of that into the TDM follow-up body of work to kind of engage with the transportation management associations, understand kind of where they're at now with kind of COVID and looking at the future, but also kind of weave some of the questions that Michelle, which I think she did a very good job in her scope of work, identifying some of these questions about kind of what makes a successful service. So that's, I think that's one question I kind of put out there, and I'm curious. I know it's not a ton of money. It's only like $20,000. But it's definitely something MAPC is interested in. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to try to advance some of that. So that's one thing. And then I also just wanted to let folks know that there were a couple studies that were not that are not being recommended here. There's one that gets at bus rapid transit, and I will say that MAPC, we are doing a lot in coordination with the MBTA on advancing, bus rapid transit like features, bus priority. And I think the T is doing a ton of work here, and CTPS is actually wrapping up a body of work that will be very helpful in this area too. So I feel like that's not. I feel like that body. I'm not upset that body of work's not being recommended, even though I did highlight it, or even though I ranked it pretty high. And then the SWAP study, looking at kind of coordinating around e-commerce and warehousing. That's probably something that MAPC will also try to take on in some way. So that was not recommended, but I think that's something we can try to work on through potentially even some of our UPWP resources. And then there was another one about continuing CTPS's resilience planning, which is another area that MEPC, we're also very interested in continuing to try to advance understanding of climate resilient infrastructure and helping cities and towns get educated on that. And I think that's an opportunity where we can coordinate with CTPS on the great work that the presentation we got at last MPO meeting from Seth Asante, for example, and continue to advance that work in the region. So I just wanted to kind of throw those things out there. But happy, maybe if we could go back to my question about just about the TDM follow-up body of work.
Thanks, Eric. And I will add on the BRT concept. We did discuss it with the transit planning group here and with the operations planning folks. It sounds like with the bus network redesign sort of coming through and the outcomes of that, it might be something to reconsider sort of next year once we have a better sense of what bus network redesign is going to look like.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the timing of that, I think you're absolutely right. Like bus network redesign, the idea is that would be, if there is support for that, then those route changes would go into effect like next summer. And then from there, you start to hone in on other actual BRT infrastructure like investments. So the timing could be like the next UPWP cycle for additional kind of technical support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the TDM follow-up item with the innovative transit financing angle, was the sort of this current year's TDM efforts, those were sort of a partnership, correct, between sort of CTPS and MAPC putting those on, or were those primarily CTPS?
No, those are a partnership, and so I'm, I know these are largely like educational, kind of awareness events, but I think there is an opportunity here to bring a lot of the real practitioners in TDM together and to say like, okay, and I think by doing that, we could actually answer, we could like we might not even need to do a discrete study where we could advance some of the questions that Michelle has in her body of work. So I feel like there might be a way to kind of fold some of that into this. But I know Sandy's probably the person who will oversee that. So I'd like to get Sandy's perspective.
Yes, as Eric said, I'm the person who's managing CTPS's current fiscal year 21 TDM work. And as Eric also said, it is really a partnership between myself and some other folks at CTPS who are working on it, and Allison Felix and Travis Pollock at MAPC. And just for those who aren't familiar, what we're doing is hosting a couple of forums on the practice of TDM. We did one in the spring. We're planning another one for late summer before the beginning of the new fiscal year. And the idea is really to explore interest at both agencies and in all of our stakeholders in doing more regional TDM coordination and planning and research, because this is something that MAPC has worked on in the past. CTPS hasn't been super involved with it, but neither of our agencies has been super involved with it recently. And what we're trying to figure out is, I think, twofold. First is, what is the interest in terms of a research agenda, a coordination agenda? And it sounds like, Eric, you've identified something that could be of real interest here. And then also building kind of more substantial and permanent models for coordinate and mechanisms for coordination on TDM topics going forward. And so what we're proposing with the $20,000 in the 2022 UPWP is not so much like a study that would generate a report. It's just a little bit of a fund for someone to spend time on that coordination and helping out with that research on a partnership basis. So the answer, I think, to what you're saying, Eric, is basically like, yes, that's something would definitely be of interest. And then,
again, if you read like and Michelle did she put a whole kind of a scope outline together with a lot of questions. A lot of them kind of get at what are effective TDM measures, and particularly with a focus on kind of shuttle buses. And so I think that is something, I think that's a topic we could kind of weave in here. And even, a lot of that data exists with like the TMAs. I think historically they reported some of that too. But anyways, I guess I throw that out there as a way to try to address some of those issues with this kind of continuing body of work.
Great.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to address Eric's other questions as well?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Eric brought up something very valuable, which is that just because something isn't in the staff recommended, something that's in the universe isn't in the staff recommended list, does not mean that we're not proposing it for it to happen in some format, right? This is kind of the 3C federal planning funds funded section of the UPWP. There is also work that we do on contract to MassDOT and the MBTA. Sometimes some of the MBTA related concepts from the UPWP universe end up being funded through that direction. We're still in conversations about that this year, what those studies might be. And finally, some of the things that are in the universe become more permanent proposals for CTPS. And in fact, that's what we're proposing with the resilience concept that Eric mentioned, is that instead of becoming a discrete study, which is a one-time thing, that it's going to become a permanent budget line for CTPS. It's going to go in a different chapter of the UPWP, and that we'd put a small amount of money toward creating a CTPS resilience program as part of our core MPO activities. So that is something that is not on the staff recommended list of discrete studies, but we are intending to happen next year and permanently thereafter.
Great, thanks. Tom O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a couple of comments, questions, I guess. Obviously, you're not going to just take the top 8 and pick those. There are other factors that play into all this. But just looking at A2, Healthy Streets Look Back, obviously scored very high by almost everybody. So I was curious if there was a particular reason why that one wasn't chosen.
Yeah, in particular, that's a good question. So our feeling about it as staff is that was a statewide program that was run by MassDOT, and that the evaluation would likewise need to be statewide. And in addition, it's one of those things for which there might be other funding sources, such as those MassDOT controlled planning funds that we would be able to tackle that through. So we are going to be looking at other ways to do that type of work. But the thought was that it having it live as a discrete study was not necessarily the right place for it.
Okay.
If anybody else from CTPS wants to add to that, please go ahead.
I would like to add to that, actually, since this is sort of a MassDOT proposed study concept. We really were envisioning more of a regional approach because MassDOT does have the Shared Streets and Spaces program, but obviously MassDOT's not the only entity out here sort of trying these ideas and trying these concepts. I know a lot of the cities and towns, particularly in the Boston region, did a lot of efforts locally on their own, took their own initiative. And it might be helpful not only for MassDOT's program, but for sort of the outreach work that CTPS and MAPC do and the technical assistance work to have a better understanding of sort of just what has been tried and what has worked and what hasn't worked. So just sort of our perspective on the concept.
M4, Eric had mentioned that that's the swap warehousing logistics. I think we talked about that at the last meeting, and it sounded like there was pretty good support for it. It scored pretty well, and I know it's specific to the swap subregion, but I also feel like that one could apply to any of the subregions. Really, I think we're all feeling and seeing the same kind of activity in our region. So I would just advocate for that particular project. And then finally, just a question, maybe not to put that on the spot, but the congestion pricing is recommended, scored pretty well. And I see that MassDOT had it ranked last out of all the proposed studies. Is there any particular reason for that, or is there something else going on? Or?
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. Unless Sandy, you wanted to address swap warehousing first.
Sure, we can do swap warehousing first. And the brief answer is that, yes, this is definitely something of concern. We discussed it substantially internally, and our concern with this concept is that the proposed budget is, we felt, not sufficient to do it justice, essentially, and that it was already fairly large by the standards of discrete studies, and increasing it further would squeeze out a bunch of other things that we want to do. So it's definitely something we want to do and are interested in pursuing dialogue about how to find money for it, because it's work that, you know, we're interested in as staff, and it's work that we recognize is critically important to many of our stakeholders and to the region. But our thought at this stage is that the UPWP is not the correct vehicle for it.
Thank you.
And then on the
I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't know what study you were referring there, Sandy.
That was M4, the swap warehousing logistics and mitigation. It's about e-commerce warehousing.
Thank you. Thanks.
And then on the congestion pricing, I think, you know, we sort of, from MassDOT, have the same perspective that we've had in previous years when this has come up. Just, we don't really see it as a good use of the UPWP and the good use of UPWP funds. I think in particular, just thinking of, you know, we were talking about the swap warehousing, and that budget wasn't enough to do this sort of focused study, but we're proposing sort of using about almost half of that amount to try to kick off a congestion pricing study, which is sort of a big picture idea that requires a lot of buy-in from a lot of stakeholders, not just in the Boston region, but sort of statewide. And, you know, the study concepts there, I do appreciate there was some effort to narrow the focus and create sort of a more conceptual kickoff idea instead of, you know, grappling the whole enchilada at once. But just thinking like the Vision Zero work that came out last year, you know, is an interesting read, and there's a lot of good information to sort of get, but is it more information than we would get from sort of doing some independent research as board members? I'm not exactly sure, particularly given the price at $60,000. I think that those funds can just be used elsewhere on some of the other studies that have a little more agreement.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Could I get some clarification? You brought up the Vision Zero study at 35,000, but then you referenced 60,000, which is the congestion pricing. What connection were you making between the Vision Zero phase 2 and the congestion pricing?
Oh, I was discussing the phase 1 of the Vision Zero, where it was sort of a report summarizing what's happened in other locations. So the one that was just completed, not the one in the universe for this.
Right,
year.
but I didn't understand the tie-in to the price of the congestion pricing at 60,000. Or did I mishear that?
Oh, it wasn't tied into the price of the congestion pricing. It was just more the work product. So the work product would be relatively similar, sort of a summary of what's been done in other areas. And that sort of literature review doesn't seem like it's worth the 60,000 on this particular topic, given
For congestion pricing, that's what this is a literature review?
That was my impression, yeah.
Well, have you been party to the congestion pricing conversations the MPO has been having? I mean, everybody's aware of Governor, you know, let's just put on the table, everybody's aware of Governor Baker's position, and you work for the governor, I understand that. But I guess I'm wondering, the thing about congestion pricing, that the way I look at it is it's gonna take a long time to figure out, because this stuff just does, but I don't understand the game we're playing with congestion pricing if all we're gonna do is do a literature review. I guess maybe I don't, Leonard, maybe this comes down to what the heck are what the conversation that preceded this? What are the scopes? What are we talking about? Maybe we need to know that. Or at the end of the day, we're gonna have a vote on it. And if whatever's in congestion pricing, people who are for it are gonna go for it. I was just a little surprised that there wasn't any lack of interest in it. Even down the road, even to set something up, because how do you get off the dime here? It's not easy. It takes a while to do this, unless you just I don't know, I guess you could just wing it and implement it. Maybe it's that simple, but all right, thanks. I didn't quite understand the connections that would be made. While I have the floor, could I just say one thing that I'm having troubles with the staff recommended list, Sandy, is I see a list here. If we were in person, I'd have 2 sheets in front of me. I'd toggle between them. I can't toggle between. So it's like, what was the rating of the Vision Zero Phase 2? I know it was around 10 or something, but to compare the 2 lists, how do we do that? I know that there's the list, but it's more like with the thing that seems easier to me is you have what? Trains coming by. You have like 8 projects. What did the average score relate to for those 8 projects that you're proposing? And then I'd get down to what the scope of this stuff is, because what I don't understand is there seemed to be a lot of interest in issues with the South, bottlenecks with the South Shore, got a pretty high score. And what do we do? Maybe there's a good reason why we're not doing that. It's not enough money. It's maybe it makes more sense to go through the committee survey results about what you don't, real quick, like what you don't see that's worthwhile in pursuing for this stuff, like work zone impacts, which, by the way, I didn't write down that as a priority, but if you see what I'm saying. So we're working off the CTPS staff list, but what we're missing is what you have up here right now. But we can't really toggle back and forth. It would be great if it would be on one list, and it's the easiest way would be the CTPS list. So we can't do it. We don't have it, but maybe verbally you could talk to us about it as we get into the conversation. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Sandy.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah,
there was a lot in Tom's comment. May I briefly comment on the first part, the congestion pricing part, and then pass it on to Sandy and others to do the rest?
Sure.
I just wanted to comment on the lit review aspect of the comments, in that that it's definitely oversimplifying what would be an empirical study, in the context that the board has had evolving conversations and we've been working on retooling ourselves to do better scenario planning. So this isn't about, the current political context. What it's about is understanding both the input we've received through our current fiscal year big ideas study, where we've been talking to a wide range of stakeholders in the region and communities to understand what people believe are some of the most important transportation topics, pricing being one of them, and looking more around how people have designed their systems and thinking about how we can then apply that understanding to create a more meaningful scenario planning process. And that scenario planning process is being carried out by what you've heard about recently in terms of our updating and changing the way we do our modeling in an exploratory way. So there's a number of linkages there that would make this study meaningful and not a standalone. But it's that sort of is in the longer range plan sphere of thinking, and less so in that you're going to implement something, in the coming year or two. It's more about the exploration, helping people understand how a system like that might work and what it would mean. So that's I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. It's still probably not as clear as you'd want, and I'm happy to talk more, but I'm also happy to pass it off to the other questions, which I think were very good about how to process this information.
No, thank you.
And to Tom's point, it is a little difficult to switch back between them. I know I made a little list of the MassDOT priorities that weren't included in the staff recommendation that I'm also flipping back and forth between. So if I'm looking back and forth frantically, that's what's going on my end. I think Len, you are up next.
Sure, thank you. The key is virtual desktops. so I'm kind of flipping back and forth between virtual desktops a lot myself. And I appreciate what Tegan said, and I have strong opinions, but I'm not locked into anything. And that's what's been really good about this process, as I've experienced it, because I had my initial opinions, and then we had a discussion in an early UPWP meeting, and then we had a discussion in the RTAC subcommittee on the 3C subcommittee. And then we had another UPWP topic theme. We discussed the UPWP studies in another RTAC meeting, and I found my mind changing with every meeting, but I felt my conclusions were getting better. And so what Tegan explained about the potential of the congestion study has me feeling differently about it, and so that's part of the deliberative process. And so I look forward to more of that, because my concern was, it was fairly far down on the list of averages, and another metric that I came up with was looking at the variation / standard deviation of the scores, and some of them were pretty tight, and some of them were kind of spread out, and it's kind of as an aside, if we do have a larger conversation, or when we have a larger conversation, I'm definitely interested in hearing from those who scored certain things low, just to see what their thinking is, either before, at the top of the conversation, or after they've heard from people who have supported them. But quick question, how much do we have to spend?
I believe it's 710, 720 minus
Okay.
the recurring work.
I saw that as the total of the studies, so that's how much we have to spend.
Yeah.
Great. And let me go back over. Sorry. So how much? It's just one sheet I don't have in front of me. So how much does the innovation in transit study cost?
That was the one from Representative Socolo.
Yeah.
I believe that was $80,000.
Okay.
Let me double check that.
All right. That's fine.
Yeah, that was $80,000, and she had potentially some bond funding for that at the governor's discretion.
Right. And so the percentage of the MPO that responded to the survey?
The survey only goes to UPWP committee members, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 responses out of 11 or 12 members.
Oh, that's pretty good. So it's only the UPWP members, not the rest of the board. But that's good. I think that makes for a kind of better, a more informed kind of response. So in short, I am supportive, of the studies that were chosen by the staff. And as I said, I had concerns about the congestion pricing, but hearing Tegan's explanation, and I'm more supportive, and I definitely look forward to seeing the scope. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Daniel?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so a few things. I'm supportive of the staff recommendations too. I think I would have preferred that there was a little bit more extrapolation or presentation at the beginning about sort of these, there are certain studies that obviously came up high on the list of priority for the members that answered the survey, and so we can't see how exactly things shook out with the internal survey. So this is basically the lists that we have. So I think it would have been helpful to talk a little bit about some of these higher ranking studies and why they weren't included just at the forefront, so that we can get that out of the way. So a couple of things. I think one thing, a question about the bus electrification, since that was one that Arlington had put at the top, and I think we heard quite a lot of support from multiple public comments, and so I'd like to know more about what why that was not put on, or what the conversations are perhaps with the T regarding that study question. And then again on congestion pricing, I'll say what I've said before. I think I support this. I think certainly if the study is looking at how the if it's not excuse me, just like a literature review or something, I think the understanding is how it might work in the Boston area, what kinds of challenges or what kinds of policy changes might have to take place. I think that's important. I think that we've been talking about it for a long time. It needs to get off the ground with something. I think it's been kicked the can down the road on this quite a number of times. And I feel like if this leads to something that perhaps leads to another follow-up study like some of these other studies, I think that would be really helpful. So I would support it, given that it would have a Boston area focus and not be just sort of a review, which I think, you just listen to transportation or Massachusetts, transportation for Massachusetts, excuse me. And I think, they've done a lot of research in this area. And the last question I have is, when it comes to funding studies, and we talk about whether, is funded with this or that, do these studies, when it comes to being funded with like PL funds or federal funds, can they only be funded with federal funds or through a contract with like the MBTA or something? My question is, can the funds be mixed, or can they never be mixed? You have to only fund it, like if you fund the congestion pricing and maybe it needs more money and the state would throw in, or 20,000 or something. Is that possible, or is that simply not possible? So those are my questions. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. I'll speak to the bus electrification item a bit. I know this didn't factor into the staff recommendation at all, but the bus modernization team took a really close look at the scope as written. I think essentially their needs are much more specific on how they're electrifying the fleet and where they are in the process. So like one note they made was just item 3 in the scope. They're already aware it needs 9 individual power studies of like individual bus facilities. And so I think the concern on the bus modernization team's front is that the scope was just too general and not specific enough into one exact task. But there might be some opportunity to coordinate more on what the specific needs are and get a more narrow scope in there in the future.
Can I add something to that, Ben?
Yep.
Because Dan, it's a good question, but this is one of those things that, on the one hand, it's happening, and then it's happening in the sense that I think sometime this year the T is supposed to start addressing the Forest Hills yard as far as fitting that so that starting where that can handle electrification. And they're doing some of that work in Cambridge, if I'm right, Ben. So this is one of those cases where this is happening. I'm not sure the pace that it's happening, but then I'd bring up, I think it's good that the study's not in there, because I'm echoing the chair's point. What utility is it going to add to things? Because it's happening now, and it would have to be pretty specific, as I imagine. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and thank you. I just want to respond. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that was a confusion point for myself at the beginning to begin with, because they were asking for something, and there's a lot of support from different organizations, and there seemed to be a disconnect or a miscommunication of they wanted something, but like you said, there's things already happening. It wasn't really clear that whether the things that were happening were sort of the same as what they're being asked. So thank you.
Yeah.
I can speak a little bit to the sort of the mixing of funds question. So MassDOT does provide a match for the PL funds. So that's sort of one way in which the funds are already a little mixed. So there's some state participation already. When it comes to sort of the MPO sort of controlled or the MassDOT controlled funding sources, we typically don't mix those, just because you end up with too many competing interests and people like pulling in different directions, the project scope. So it's a little cleaner to have either it be directed by one entity or the other, to sort of prevent those. Because I know we don't all share exactly the same perspective on issues. I think there is, in theory, opportunity, down the road for other outside funding sources, but that's not something that we currently pursue. Looks like I have Steve Olenoff next.
So similar to what other people have said, I'm happy with what's been chosen, but I'm concerned about some of the things that weren't chosen and how they could be done elsewhere. And so certainly I'm happy T2 for Blue Hills has been, I spoke at length of that on the last meeting. And so moving on, I agree with what Eric was saying about transportation domain management and the what is it, the T10 innovative transit financing, because I think that's really important. My town, I'm trying to get them to do shuttle bus service. I want to have them do it right. I want it to be successful. So we really, if there's anything we need to know about who's done it right, who hasn't done it right, I think that's really important. So coming up with other means, whether it's MAPC that does it or whoever does that, I think that's really important. Now I noticed L4, the freight, scored high but wasn't done, and then the M4 that's very similar, L4 and M4. But we do have and I've always advocated for freight studies. At one time we didn't have them, then we finally got them. We now have money directly in the CTPS budget for freight every year. So I was wondering if really what's going to be done on that, from that part of the budget, and could some of this be part of that? Does anybody have any idea on that?
Yeah, the short answer to that question, Steve, is yes. That's definitely a potential use of those funds. You brought up L4, the transportation and freight and mode shift. And that was kind of one of our honorable mentions. It was one of the things that, because it scored well and it's potentially interesting, that we wanted to get in there, but felt that we were constrained by having other things that we wanted to recommend.
Right, so that still could possibly come out of the regular CTPS freight budget, that amount, that's fixed amount allocated every year now.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to talk to the program manager about that. That's Bill Kuttner, but we will definitely keep it under consideration both for this year and for future years.
Okay. And finally, on the whole congestion pricing saga that we're having here, just and the basic question is, what is the study? Is the study looking at literature to decide is congestion pricing a good thing or not, or is it to be whether we should go ahead and figure out how we're going to do it here? What's already been mentioned, 9 out of 10 cities do congestion pricing. Boston is the only one that doesn't. So I mean, that's enough literature search for me. I don't need any more to say, yeah, we need to start doing it. So I think the congestion pricing study should be, the scope going forward should be not on how other people have done it, but how we're going to do it, and let's get going on it. It's long overdue.
Looks like David Kozis.
Not agree with me, or you don't want to say.
I don't know. I'm also perfectly fine with this, all these staff recommendations. As far as what people are saying about the congestion pricing, maybe I would have been even more supportive 2 years ago, right? I think we're sort of all assuming that congestion is going to happen again as bad as it was before, or even worse. And maybe that's true, and if that is true, maybe some kind of congestion pricing could eventually help to shift behavior. But at the same time, I think that we've learned a lot, in the past 14 months. A ton of people have learned that they can have a very flexible schedule now, and they can work at home more. And, we all know, people could travel at different times, and maybe that supports doing the study. I'm not sure, but, commuter rail schedules have now gone hourly instead of peaked. And I just think that nobody really knows, especially at this moment right now, right, what is going to happen, what's going to happen permanently with people and their travel patterns. So I'm just not sure, but I'll be perfectly fine to include it also.
Tom Ben?
Hey, so a couple of things. One, I think it would have been helpful for us to get the staff recommendations ahead of time in their reasoning behind it, instead of having to kind of hash through it all now. And I also thought, when Eric spoke about the different ones that, looks like MAPC is doing part of that. That was helpful too. And again, that would have been good to have maybe earlier on, because we probably could have eliminated some of this discussion today. Out of the ones that, some of them had for their top 4 was L1, the tip generation follow-up, M6, future of the curb, T1, opportunities for the BRT in the Boston region, and T4, bus electrification. And again, as Daniel had said, not realizing what's actually going on, versus, looking at doing a study for this. I know we still are very interested in that study. So I guess maybe having some more background as to what's actually going on ahead of time would have been helpful. But out of those, out of the staff recommendations, they have, they are recommending L1 and M6. So, I'm going to be okay with the staff recommendations. As far as on the congestion pricing, I agree with David. I think we don't know where that's going to go as far as what congestion is going to be like when we kind of get back to normal. I'm hearing conflicting things about, companies wanting their employees all to come back to work because they're finding it being very inefficient. And also from employees not wanting to be home all the time. So I think it'll end up probably being a mixed bag on that, and how that'll affect congestion will be interesting. I do know from personal experience, definitely going north on the rush hour home, that's definitely backing up earlier and earlier than it had been for a long time. Coming in, it doesn't seem like it's as bad, but I do know seeing that. So, that's kind of where I am with a lot of these right now.
Mr. Chair, can I throw something in there about Tom's comments and Dave's? I understand what you're saying. You're right. You're right. In some ways, it's alarming that traffic's picking up and it's only 18% off, they're saying, from 2019 in some routes. But the other thing I just say to you in just discussion in general is there's one thing about congestion that it's very fudgeable and flexible. And we all know that once it gets so bad, people won't take that trip. Once it gets better, what I'm saying is rideshare is going to start booming again, as I would think rideshare will drive a lot of the congestion. And I think that there's capacity there in the roadway. Evidence suggests that motorists will use it. And that's all I'd say to you and David. I understand your point. You got a good point, but there's something about that capacity that people like to gobble up when it's not used. Thanks, Mr. Chair, for my 2 cents on that.
Sure, thanks, Tom. Lynn, did you raise your hand?
Sure, yes, I did. The problem I have, it's a good problem to have, is that I respect all of you and your opinions. And then when you all say something, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's something I need to factor in. So I got to tell you, I'm probably going to be vacillating over the congestion pricing quite a bit. And so last year, I think we had more studies, than we had money to spend. And I'm wondering, can we maybe get maybe like a couple more studies added to the list, of things that we consider, so that if one of these come off, we can plug something else in a way that fits in with the staff's resources. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I can respond to that quickly. So we do in fact have a couple that we were considering. I mentioned as honorable mentions before. One of them was the freight and mode shift one, L4, and the other one was actually the BRT study, which it sounds like other folks are indicating not so much support for this year. So we can add those to the list as kind of informal possibilities. I think that the most prominent candidate as a next down the list would be something regarding freight, maybe doing a little bit of work with swap and the mode shift concept. I will say, Len, that last year the universe was only 15 study concepts. This year was 26. And that last year we ended up basically being able to fund almost everything that was in the universe through one means or another. Not all of them became discrete studies, but we actually got to basically everything. And unfortunately, that's not going to be true this year because for whatever reason, the universe is twice as long, and we got lots and lots of ideas.
Well, you make things happen in the universe, Sandy. You're probably the next best thing to GOD. Thank you.
I don't know, this meeting's being recorded, Leonard. That might be a bold statement. Well, I do want to reiterate, I'm just not supportive of the congestion pricing study. And I know, of course, that's partially I'm representing MassDOT, but I think also sort of just as someone thinking of the best use of MPO funds, it's just a big budget for the outcome. And I think if we're talking about this is going to inform the long range plan, we have a long range plan budget that we, can read T4Mass's great work and some of the other great work out there and inform staff and inform our modeling efforts. We have a budget for improving our modeling efforts. So we can, if that's what this is leading towards, then we have budgets to do that as part of our ongoing work. And I just think some of the other opportunities that had more consensus around them that were skipped in order to include this one on the staff recommendation, particularly L4 is pretty high on MassDOT's list. I know our freight coordinator had a lot of support for that one. The Healthy Streets work seemed like it had broad support, and that had support from our multimodal team and from the shared streets coordinator here at MassDOT in the highway division. And I wanted to know another one on the list here that we haven't talked much about, but I had an interesting note from the T on, which is T6, the fare policy. So the long and short of it was the fare management team thought if you just removed the words post-COVID from it, it would be beneficial to their long-term work. Sort of focusing on what does that flexible commute look like as far as a monthly pass goes, because they're already sort of implementing or figuring out what they're going to implement in the coming year on fare policy. But as they shape that in the long term, something at the end of federal fiscal year 22 would probably be helpful for them as a work product. So just my 2 cents here. And then Steve Olenoff, you have your hand up? Oh, sorry. And then David Kozis, you're good?
I forgot to take my hand down, but since you called on me, I agree with what you just said, Ben. And so with the $60,000 for the congestion pricing, can someone remind us of a difference? Like, I would prefer to see the T4. Also, I hope that's how I scored it. But I don't remember what the price is of that project or if any other project was about 60,000.
So T4, let me double check this one time. T4 is the bus electrification one. Yeah, so that was $100,000. There are the MBTA fares one, I think, was around that vicinity, was 50 to 75,000. The flexible fare policy that was in that range. And then the L4 that several people brought up was a scalable, but somewhere in the vicinity of 40,000 or above. And again, all of these are in the UPWP universe, which I'll just link again in the chat so everybody can see. We have in the staff recommendation, we did change some of the budgets to reflect certain scope changes in various places. So it may not correspond exactly. Yeah, I just wanted to note also something interesting about this scoring for the congestion pricing. which is that it has a very binary distribution. Kind of, there's a bunch of people who scored it very highly and a bunch of people who scored it very low. So it's like really the whole range of opinions reflected on that, which I think we're seeing in this discussion as well.
Okay. Tom Katzis.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A couple of things. I'm circling back to electrification. I just don't want to give anybody the impression that I wasn't in favor of that study. I am. I guess I just don't understand exactly where it fits. But the thing about electrification that folks, I'm sure everybody saw it today or yesterday, was the president or US DOT has come out with a timeline for bus electrification in terms of their climate goals. Everybody's seen that, right? Does that do anything to our deliberations here? Not expecting an answer. I'm just saying we've got an administration that's taken a shot at climate goals. Maybe one of the best ways of doing it is with the fleets. It sort of brings the electrification maybe back on the table in terms of relevance with the federal government's. But I don't know the answer. It's a rhetorical question. And hey, Mr. Chair, I've led the MPO in apologies over the years. So on my way out, let me give you one. What I said about the governor, I in some ways I don't regret it because it's sort of like talking turkey. And what I say is I respect the governor and the administration's right to set an agenda. And I should have listened a little more to what you were saying, Ben, about where your stake was in congestion pricing. I understand it a little better. And I don't think that there's anything wrong necessarily to pointing out the philosophical differences. And at the end of the day, my guess would be if this went in front of the MPO, it might be a divided board. We see people with different opinions here, and maybe the money is spent elsewhere. But let me just say, I was, my last apology on the MPO, I'll give it to you. I should have kept the politics out of it. I mean, we could talk about this afterwards, but it does no good here for a public meeting because I just didn't listen enough to what you were saying. And your reasons are valid. They can be disagreed with, but they're perfectly valid. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Tom, I'm going to miss you telling it the way it is.
Thank you, Tom. Looks like Eric, you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just contribute to the conversation in a couple places. So I do want to respect the staff's, recommendation, and I definitely understand where they come from, where they kind of get together and are looking at, what are these proposals, what's the body of work in front of them, and kind of how do they balance that with the technical, expertise of the different staff at CTPS, and just trying to balance the workflow, within that over the course of the year. So I want to respect that. So I do give a certain amount of, real respect to their recommendation. Secondly, I haven't said anything about congestion pricing. I mean, MAPC, we are big supporters of studying congestion pricing, and I think that long term we will see congestion come back at some point, whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. But long term, there will be congestion on our highways, and I think even if we're all driving electric cars in 15 years. We might address, the air quality and the GHG from transportation, but we're still going to have congestion. And I think understanding the strategies, particularly when it comes to pricing, about how to create those, incentives and kind of disincentives, I think are really important. And again, this is just a study, and I think getting the CTPS staff educated about these issues, I think is like moving in that direction is a good thing to do. I do think that ultimately the tools that CTPS have when it comes to modeling are some of the best tools that we could have to try to answer questions about like what would be the prices and the impacts. MAPC, we've tried to do some of this too with some of our own modeling tools. We have seen that to change travel behavior, you do have to charge a very big very big price. And I've always been interested in really understanding that more so, because I think that does come with the politics of it. Is, you know, it's at some point it becomes very politically challenging if to change behavior is going to be, you know, very costly to individual, you know, users. But I think studying that is really important to understand that and contribute to the conversation. So definitely support that. And then on MBTA bus electrification, I mean, I will say the general manager has a pretty good op-ed in the Boston Globe today about what they're doing to advance bus electrification. And I thought that Scott Hamway gave a great presentation to the FMCB a week or so ago, which really identifies kind of their constraints with respect to bus maintenance facilities. And it's really about trying to advance bus maintenance facilities. So again, I haven't gotten the sense that it's for lack of research at the T or understanding of like the technology, but really it's about logistical things that are unique to the MBTA system that sort of hamstrings their ability to advance bus electrification, you know, faster than some would want.
Thanks, Eric. So we'll call on Matthew Peterson.
Hi, I'm Matthew Peterson from Transit Matters. I just wanted to speak briefly about the bus electrification thing before I have to run. So I do think that, like, when we proposed this study proposal about bus electrification, our big idea was that it's a bit more than just the MBTA, because there are other transit services operating in the Boston region that could benefit from electrification. And we also know that the MBTA is focusing on a single technology for its electrification and is not really looking at the whole range of electrification technologies out there. And, you know, there might be good reasons for that. But so we propose this as a way for all the different transit operating stakeholders in the Boston region to get a better idea of what the landscape of bus electrification is like, so that other RTAs, municipalities, TMAs, other transit operators can make more informed decisions about their decarbonization and electrification plans. And so I think that this is really important because some involve fixed infrastructure, some involve non-fixed infrastructure, some involve terminal charging facilities, others involve catenary wire. We think the MPO is in a good position to get this information for this broad range of stakeholders, from municipalities to RTAs and even the MBTA itself, maybe. And I think as Tom Katz has said, we think it does really tie into the more broader federal priorities for electrification. So thanks for letting me speak. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Sure. Thank you. And while calling on members of the public, Miley Paneria-Langer.
Hi, this is Miley Paneria-Langer, and thank you for your time. I'm with Friends of the Blue Hills, and I see Mark Smith has already left, but I just wanted to spend some time thanking you all for including T2 on the staff recommendations, as well as looking at this community survey results, just super briefly. Last year, we know CDC recommended keeping those green spaces open during the pandemic because we know that it's critical for our physical and mental health. And we also know that the communities in Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury have all been historically, historically have poorer health outcomes than other regions in the Boston area. And we also know, I'm a public health practitioner, and so I think of health in all policy strategies. And I really am grateful to the committee for including this, because this study can really at least provide the beginnings really of looking at equity and access to the Blue Hills so that everyone can benefit from it. And so, you know, a lot of people don't have cars, like Mark was saying earlier. And so I'm very excited and grateful from Friends of the Blue Hills and our partners who've also had proposed this study. So just wanted to spend a little bit of time thanking you, and acknowledging equity and access is important, especially to those communities who historically have been marginalized.
Thank you. Daniel Amstis.
Thank you. I just want to add to what Eric was saying a minute ago about, again, congestion pricing, and also to respond or speak to the sort of reservations, I guess, of other members, in my opinion, that, you know, it's not simply about it's car congestion, but we also, nobody's mentioned the fact that, you know, the MBTA, the ridership on the MBTA is still certainly not bounced back. Perhaps now that many more people are getting, you know, vaccinated, that perhaps they'll get back to, you know, pre-pandemic levels. But even if people are staying home to work, every one of those people that isn't getting on the T, if they're going to get to where they need to go some other way. And I think more people getting in cars is a very real possibility. I think congestion, it's really only a matter of time before it returns. And I think that we need to be set up for having another tool in our toolbox for dealing with the issue. And I think it will probably likely be several years before it happens, and trying to get some more information on studying how it would work within the Boston region better sets us up for actually having that happen, in a few years. Not going to happen next year, so that would be that's what I think in terms of why I think getting something done about it sooner rather than later is preferable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Eric, do you have your hand up, or is that just from last time? Okay. Steve Olenoff.
I hate to disagree with everyone, but turn on your radio, listen to the traffic reports, get out on the road. Traffic is rapidly going right back to the way it was. Every single day, it's getting bigger. So I think we can't wait anymore. We need to look into congestion pricing. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. All right, not seeing any more comments here. I believe, Sandy, you're looking for a vote.
Yeah, and I would suggest that the best way to do this at this point is probably to take an up and down vote on the staff slate. And if it does not pass, then we can discuss alternatives to presumably the congestion pricing study would be the point of conflict. But how to handle that is up to you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, I think that's a decent approach.
I see Eric has his hand up though.
Oh, Eric, or are you just voting?
I mean, I'll make a motion to approve the staff recommendation.
All right. Len?
I'll second it.
Great. We'll pull up my list here for roll call. All right, MAPC.
Yes.
Town of Arlington.
Town of Arlington, yes.
BTD.
There's plus and minuses, but I agree with the approach. Yes.
City of Newton.
City of Newton votes yes.
Town of Norwood.
Town of Norwood, yes.
City of Somerville.
City of Somerville, yes.
RTAC.
Check yes.
Great. MassDOT votes no. So it looks like it passes. Is that good for you, Sandy?
That is what I need. Thank you.
Great. All right. So looks like we're moving on to the next agenda item here. Member items. Are there any committee members who have any other questions or information you want to bring before the board? Len?
Yes, I just want to say to Tom and Kazis, I will miss you, but maybe I won't have to miss you if you come and join in RTAC meetings. We can do as a volunteer, and so there's a certain joy in doing something because you want to instead of because you have to. So welcome to join us anytime, especially now that we're remote. But even when we're in person.
Yeah. Len, I appreciate that. And what I should have this morning, I wasn't expecting, I thought we'd have more NPO meetings in May, but I guess I want to say to everybody on this call that I was remiss in not mentioning RTAC, AKA JRTC, Joint Regional Transportation Council, to RTAC. And what I'd say, Leonard, is when I started with the NPO, RTAC was one thing. And when I'm finishing with the NPO, it's a different thing. And I think it's it's a positive transformation, and it's not being negative on the previous generation of folks. There were some people who put their heart and soul into that, but I was remiss in that, and I'd say you played a big part in that in the most recent iteration of it. But thank you, Leonard. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I was just following and taking footsteps. If I'm keeping up with her just a little bit, then I'm happy with that. And I think she set the bar really high, and it's a pleasure trying to stay up there. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned Tig, and you've already forgotten. It seems like Tig probably thinks she's been at CTPS now for 10 years or something.
So, Tom, I just want to say I'm going to miss you too. And as far as the advisory council, especially when I was chair of it for 4 years, of all the MPO members, you were not only the one that came the most to the advisory council meetings, most of the time you were the only MPO member who would actually come to the advisory council meeting. So I thank you for that. And it was nice having you. And any
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, no, there were a couple of years I might have had perfect attendance, but Dave Kostis emailed me, and I started thinking about it. Dave said, "So what, am I the senior member?" And Dave, no, the answer is Steve Olenoff is. And
I was trying to figure that out. I mean, who's been here longer, you or me?
And Len and everybody, Steve, I'd say to everybody on this call, I mean, without getting melodramatic about it, Steve has been there in a number of different capacities, and he's been there as long as I've been on the MPO. And usually everything he says makes sense, and sometimes the stuff has happened and sometimes it hasn't. But Steve, I really have enjoyed working with you. And I talk about apologies, Ben. I gave one apology to Steve about 10 years ago on the Long Island Bridge. So, Steve,
we'll have
really,
to talk.
it's
We'll have to
good
toss it
working
over
for you. And I
to
tip my cap to your commitment. I really do, Steve.
Thank
I mean, I really do.
We'll toss a coin to see who has been here the longest. I'm not sure, but I seem to remember you were here as long as I've been here. And
well, what about you and Dave Kostis? You guys didn't have that coin off there, because I think it's down to you two now. I mean, Dave Mullo doesn't count because he's the chair, as far as the members. But thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Tom O'Rourke, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just want to echo everyone else's comments. Tom, you've been a great colleague. I've enjoyed working with you, and wish you all the best. As Tom Ben said, when you speak, I always make sure to listen to what you have to say, because usually makes a lot of sense. So all the best.
Well, thanks a lot, Tom. I appreciate it. And you've been a great colleague, and he's a guy who did his JV work in RTAC and then went on. But yeah, no, Tom, I appreciate it. I respect you a lot, and I appreciate it. I do.
Thanks.
Great. So if nothing else, I guess, Sandy, you can tell us the time of the next meeting.
Yeah. So first, I want to also echo, Tom, I haven't known you nearly as long as any of these guys, but I've always enjoyed working with you, and we'll miss your presence here for sure.
Thanks, Sandy.
Yeah, next meeting, probably June 17th. We're going to be working feverishly on writing more detailed descriptions for all of these studies and getting the budget in order. And then we'll bring that materials, as much of that material as we can, back to the committee on June 17th. We'll probably also be asking for an amendment to the current 2021 UPWP at that meeting. But in the meantime, you get a 6-week break.
Great, thank you, Sandy. And is there a motion second to adjourn?
Yeah, I'll make that motion to adjourn, and I'll second that motion to adjourn, and I'll approve that motion to adjourn.
So by order of Tom Kansas, we are adjourned.
Bye-bye.